Hi, welcome. As the F-4E draws closer, a quick review of the air-to-air intercepts with a B-scope and pulse radar mode is in order. Before starting, the usual disclaimer: the topics discussed are based on freely available documentation. This means that they are heavily outdated or extremely simplistic. However, they work very well for a video game played by armchair crews. As surprising as it may sound, this is not what the real crews do. Also, be advised that I'm not going to repeat the basics of intercept geometry in this video. I have written dozens of articles about the topic and made some videos as well. If you need info, have a look at the links in the comment. Lastly, I will be using the F-4E's DDD to support the discourse. This is of course different from the F-4E displays, but for the purpose of familiarizing with the topics discussed, it will do. Through the various videos of this series, we have seen how different versions of the Phantom 2 provide different information to the user. To keep things easy, in the first part of the discussion, let's assume that we know at least the bandit heading. Knowing the bandit heading in fact allows us to compute all the other relevant information. Target aspect, or probably more appropriately here the aspect angle, then the heading cross angle, the cut, and so on. Keep in mind that if the bandit heading is provided by the avionics, it will be true, not magnetic. Similarly to the Tomcat, in fact, the WCS does not know the value of the magnetic variation at the target's location. However, as long as the mag var is not massive, it is usually not a big deal. Also, before proceeding, remember that the Navy tends to use cut and target aspect TA, whereas the Air Force uses, or used, heading cross angle HCA and aspect angle AA. As we know, these are the relative pairs of supplementary angles. Why? Don't know, to be honest. Whenever I ask, the discussion turns into a quite funny banter. Anyway, starting from the bandit heading, we can use the DBHI to determine the HCA or the cut. The indicator always points towards the heading of the aeroplane. Therefore, we just have to look clockwise or counterclockwise until we find the bandit heading. This is the HCA. On the other hand, if you prefer working with the cut, simply consider the target reciprocal and do the same operation. Sticking with the HCA, we can now add the antenna triangle and then find the aspect angle. This is because the sum of the internal angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, and therefore HCA plus ATA plus TA is equal to 180 degrees, which gives us aspect angle equals HCA plus ATA. Goes without saying that this sign must be taken into account, and more on this when we do some practical examples. Once we have the aspect, we can plan the next step. The technique to use depends on the task in mission, loadout, view, and much more. In general, the available documentation mentions only the simplest approaches, which tend to converge towards an intercept enabling the fourth quarter employment or a stern conversion turn. The first technique we will discuss is straightforward and aims to improve the odds of a front quarter Fox 1 or Fox 2 with or without VID. Since DCS is a game where IFF and coalitions are black and white, and brevities such as Outlaw or Spades are never used outside simulative groups, chances are that this will be a common intercept technique. Simply put, we want to grind down the target aspect or vice versa increase the aspect angle to improve the odds of success of the M7 Sparrow. This can be done in several ways. If you are not new to my website, you may be familiar with the cut and how it can be used to manipulate the angles. The Air Force, being the Air Force, they do something similar with the HCA, but to me it sounds less intuitive. It all starts with the assessment of the aspect angle. Ideally, we want it to be high enough, but not 18, so 180 degrees. The opposite instead if we consider the target aspect. In other words, we want the target to be as hot as possible, because this improves parameters such as the sub-C and the missile kinematics, but also not straight up our nose, as this reduces our maneuvering room and therefore our options, and makes the target more likely to spot us with their sensors. Consider the following simplified table to decide how to manipulate the angles. If TA and AA are acceptable, then you can use collision course to capture the aspect. If you're using the cut, it means having cut equal to collision course. If AA is too high and therefore TA is too low, then we should turn away from the target, placing it on the cold side of the display. With the cut, it means using the cutaway. If AA is too low and TA is too high, then we should turn into the target using the collision course ATA, so CATA, as a reference. Using the cut, it means cut into greater than or less than the collision. Once we are happy with the angles, we can lock them by turning to collision course. When we approach the employment range, then we should turn to lead collision to have the missile hit the target. Lead collision can be approximated as half of the ATA into the target. Intuitively, the missile is faster than the aeroplane, ergo it flies more directly, so to speak, towards the target. A better way to use the lead collision is following the ASC circle, which greatly simplifies the life of the crew. This is especially important when the restrictions imposed by the interlock switch are taken into account. If we plan to employ an M9, we should first verify that the version of the Fox 2 we want to use is an all aspect, as older sidewinders, for example, could not effectively be employed beyond the rear quarter. For an M9 or equivalent, the angles are usually less important. A greater offset may even help to achieve a proper lock on the target. Before moving to a more complex maneuver, let's refresh two important topics, starting from the collision course. In particular, how we can set up collision course in the first place. For the F-14, I noticed and demonstrated using Euclid the properties of the vectors displayed in the PPI scope that really help to set up CC in no time. For the F-4 instead, we only have the B-scope. However, the B-scope is different. As we know, a target on collision course does not drift on the scope. Therefore, we can observe the behavior of the target over time and try to correct our heading and reduce the drift. However, this can be a long process and we often won't have the time. We need at least a starting point. The following process is based on the properties of the intercept triangle when two aeroplanes fly at the same speed. In this case, in fact, target aspect and antenna triangle are equal, as the triangle is an isosceles. Therefore, CATA or collision antenna triangle equals to ATA, which in turn is equal to DTA. Looking at the intercept triangle sketch again, we find the following relation. CATA equals 180 minus the aspect angle, or CATA equals target aspect. However, in real DCS life, so to speak, aircraft hardly fly at the same speed. I wrote a study backed by maths about how the collision changes depending on the speed difference, which highlighted some interesting relations, but if we want to be direct and keep it elementary, we can start by using the relation described above and then adjust it from there. Let's now see an example of complete computation, with the only known value being the bandit heading, with the goal of achieving collision course. The fighter heading is 0.15, ATA is 40 left. This sketch is not precise down to the single degree, but close enough. First, we determine the HCA from a BDHI. Since the BDHI always points toward the fighter heading, let's rearrange the sketch to match it. Then, from 0.15 to 135, we turn right 120 degrees. And this is our HCA. Next, we find the aspect angle determined as the sum of HCA and ATA. Therefore, 120 plus 40 equals 160. So let's assume we're flying close speed. If the assumption is incorrect, at least it gives us a starting point. So doing so allows us to use the supplementary angle of the aspect angle as the collision antenna triangle. Therefore, CATA equals 180 minus aspect angle equals 180 minus 160, so 20. If we now do a simple empirical test by measuring the distances of the sketch, we find that they are very similar, and this proves that the computation was somewhat correct, as long as the aeroplanes were flying close speed. If not, we can now observe the drift and adjust. Yes, there are formulas for this as well, but we're starting to get a bit too much into the details for a refresher video. The last point worth mentioning is the time factor. This computation taken in a vacuum is correct, but if the crew requires several seconds to draw these conclusions, the variables change, and the results may be incorrect. One of the issues of the B-scope is that it does not visually represent 0 cut or 180 HCA in an intuitive manner. On the PPI instead, the target flight parallel moves vertically towards the bottom of the scope. Why does it matter? Well, in premise, it is a good peculiarity helpful to quickly build a say, but also because flying towards the bandit reciprocal has several benefits. For example, the lateral separation is captured, meaning it does not change as the range decreases, also TA equals ATA. We can also eyeball the evolution of the angles over time, as they double as the range halves. It's pretty neat, right? Conclusion, although the scope does not help us as much as we would like, we can still find the bandit setting and then use the +2 -2 rule, or another rule to find the reciprocal and carry on. As mentioned before, remember that magvar is a thing. So let's say we have launched our not really trusted M7 from the front quarter. It missed, because that's what the sparrows do. What do we do next? There are several options. You can blow through and bug out, or we can stay and fight. In this case, let's say we want to turn behind the target and employ an IR guided missile. However, the present situation does not allow us to turn behind the target, so we need to make room first. For simplicity's sake, let's do a tabula rasa and imagine we are not very close to the target, so we have time to think and act. In premise we determine the angles as we did earlier. But how much space do we actually need? The room is expressed by the lateral separation, which is the height of the intercept triangle drawn on the target's heading. British Phantoms used from 4 to 5 miles up to a dozen, depending on the altitude. For the purpose of training, most documents use 40,000 feet of lateral separation, or about 6.5 nautical miles. So I'm sticking to that value. Per se, getting to the right spot to execute this conversion is quite simple, and it all comes down to maintaining, creating or reducing the lateral separation. The following are a series of gates, or checkpoints, that can be used as a template to follow. As long as those are respected, the Phantom should be at the desired place at the beginning of the counter turn. Once the fighter is in the desired position with the desired displacement, he can start the turn, aiming to steady up behind the target. This position, with our parameters, is equal to 40 TA at 10 nautical miles. These values in fact give us a lateral separation of 40,000 feet. If this checkpoint is not matched, or our angles are different, then the crew needs to perform a displacement turn before the counter turn. This topic is not particularly complex but involves lengthy tables and discussions, therefore the details of the displacement turn, counter turn and so on are available in the link in the description box below. Before wrapping this up, a quick parenthesis to touch the topic of SA and lack of information. For a reason or another, whether it be the poor AI AWACS present in DCS or an older version of the Phantom being flown, the Gib, acronym for the god in the back or the guy with an incredible brain, may not have access to all the information necessary to compute the intercept as easily as discussed above. This is where a bit of ingenuity and experience come handy. Making some assumptions, we can presume a co-speed scenario when reasonable, and then work the equations used before in the opposite direction to find HCA and bandit heading. Another parameter that tells a lot about the scenario is the closure rate, or V sub c. V sub c is another tool that can be used to put bits and pieces together. In particular, assuming that the identity or the type of the aeroplane targeted is somewhat known, and this is simple information to obtain, low V sub c may mean that the aspect angle is quite low. In other words, the target may be flanking or running away. Moreover, if V sub c is less than the speed of the F4, then the target is cold. The same principles and observations can be applied to other parameters, and when we add the range and ETA from the B-scope, and the drift rate, and V sub c, and the approximate collision alternative angle and so on to the mix, we should have enough elements to at least build a bit of situational awareness, enough to start our intercept. So, I hope you have found this brief overview of the basic air-to-air intercept with the F4 useful. If you are a bit lost, make sure to check the links in the description box below. Moreover, the next video of this series should focus on showing practical examples conducted using the DDD of the Tomcat. Seeing the whole thing unfolding and progressing should concretely help to understand the topics discussed. Thanks for watching and take care.